History is filled with incredible stories, some forgotten, and others shrouded in mystery. In this video, we will be uncovering fascinating historical tales that you'd probably never heard of. From England's greatest social climbing family to a forgotten cultural legend. So join me as we explore all of this and more. For our first story, we are travelling back in time to 19th century England. Before we look into the lives of the Cornwallis West family, we need to look at their history. At the heart of the family was William Cornwallis West, who was born on the 20th of March 1835. On his father's side, his grandfather was Frederick West, a British MP who was in turn descended from Lieutenant General John West, 1st Earl Delaware, a major political figure and military commander of the 18th century. Going back even further, another ancestor, Thomas West, 3rd Baron Delaware, had explored the coastline of part of North America in the early 1610s, leading to the naming of the Delaware region after him. Meanwhile, William's mother's side of the family had adopted the Cornwallis name in the early 19th century, as his grandmother, Mary Ann Whitby, had become the adoptive heir of Admiral William Cornwallis, one of the great naval commanders of the British Royal Navy during the American and French Revolutionary Wars. When he died childless, much of his estate passed to Mary, and she took Cornwallis as her middle name. Hence, when William was born in 1835, he was so as the product of a marriage between scions of the West and Whitby families, with the Whitbys having adopted the name Cornwallis. This was reflected in his two stately homes, the medieval castle of Ruthin in North Wales and the Newlands Manor in Hampshire, as well as the use of the Cornwallis West surname, one which spoke of centuries of service in government, the navy, and the formation of the British Empire on both sides of the family. William trained as a lawyer in his youth, and was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn, one of the esteemed London Inns of Court, in 1862. Thereafter he had a successful career as a lawyer, a minor military official, and in local politics in Wales, eventually sitting in Parliament as an MP between 1885 and 1892. Yet, by the standards of some of his forebears, it was a comparatively unremarkable career. Perhaps the most striking element of William Cornwallis West's life was his marriage and children. In 1872 he married a woman by the name of Patsy Fitzpatrick. Born on the 28th of October 1854, Patsy was just 17 years old at the time of their wedding, and William was twice her age. She had been pressed into the arranged marriage after it was discovered that she had been secretly involved in a clandestine relationship. Yet, this wasn't any relationship, as this was with Prince Edward, son of Queen Victoria, and the future King Edward VII, when he was 30 years old and she was just 16. Patsy came from a less esteemed background than her husband, yet while her name might have suggested that she was a commoner, she did come from the Irish aristocracy. The Fitzpatricks were a lordly family who controlled an extensive territory in the Irish Midlands, stretching back into the late medieval era. In the early 1540s, the head of the lordship, Barnaby Fitzpatrick, agreed to accept an English title, Baron of Upper Ossory, and to begin adopting English culture and social norms, even anglicising his Irish surname, hence the name Fitzpatrick. As a result, the family were able to survive the 2 centuries of colonial displacement of the Irish lords that followed as the English took over Ireland completely. By the time Patsy was born in the 19th century, the Fitzpatricks were a loyal element of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, having married into many English and Scottish noble lines over the years. Her marriage to William Cornwallis West in 1872 soon resulted in children. A daughter named Mary Theresa came in 1873, followed by a son George the following year, and then a second daughter Constance in 1877. It should be noted here that many believe that George was the result of his mother's affair, and was really Prince Edward's son. After this brief flurry of children at the start of their marriage, they would have no further offspring, something perhaps attributable to some natal complications for Patsy, as she was still only 22 years old when Constance was born, and under normal circumstances would have had many childbearing years left. Alternatively, this lack of further children could have been the result of her and William's strained marriage. The age difference and the circumstances in which they married meant that they were never really that close. Despite being married off to William to avoid any controversies developing over her fling with Prince Edward, Patsy, a woman whose good looks were remarked on in British high society, remained close to the future king throughout their lives. Edward had already been long married when he began his initial relationship with the 16-year-old Patsy, and it is understood that they continued to see each other quite regularly after she married. This brought the playboy heir to the Cornwallis West seaside manor at Milford-on-Sea in the late 1800s, away from the prying eyes of Queen Victoria's court, who had ostracised Patsy for her ongoing affair with the future king. Yet, despite Patsy's bad standing amongst some in Victorian society, she put her relationship with Edward to good use. By influencing the prince and her children, she got them to marry into the leading royal and aristocratic families of Europe, making them some of the most powerful and wealthy people in the world, something she had wanted since her youth. Anyone who wanted to get a sense of how influential Patsy had been over the future king need only have looked at the marriage of her eldest daughter. Mary Cornwallis West was born on the 28th of June 1873, not long at all after her parents' marriage. Daisy, as she was known to her family, and pretty much everyone else who knew her, was a noted beauty of the time, and made an impression at the Victorian court when she began attending high society events in the late 1880s and early 1890s. It was around this time that Daisy met Prince Hans Heinrich of the House of von Hochberg, a major European dynasty that had extensive estates in Central Europe. In 1883, Hans, who was 12 years older than Daisy, had been awarded the title of Prince of Pless in the German aristocracy in recognition of his family's wealth and influence, most of it founded on their lands in Silesia. This is now in southwestern Poland, but it was long considered a part of Germany, one which was abundant in coal and iron ore, and had become one of the great industrial centres of 19th century Europe. Before meeting Hans, Daisy was actually interested in a young British soldier. Yet, keen for her daughter to marry the German prince, Patsy soon arranged through her contacts that the soldier be sent away, and so he went to fight in the Zulu Wars in South Africa. Sadly, he was killed a few months later. Not long after, the marriage between Hans and Daisy was negotiated, and as the Cornwallis West family was impoverished, the Hochbergs were forced to pay for the wedding. As a gift, the couple received a huge 400-room castle, where they hosted the finest European aristocracy, and from then on, Mary became known as Princess Daisy of Pless. Daisy and Hans had numerous children. Their first daughter died in infancy in 1893, but 3 sons, Hans, Alexander and Bolko, were born in 1900, 1905 and 1910, and would generally live long lives, except Bolko. By the time this younger son was born, Daisy and Hans's marriage was increasingly turbulent, with mutual infidelities that attracted press gossip, all against the backdrop of their extravagant lives. While their marriage managed to weather the First World War years, eventually in 1922 they divorced, following which Hans married Clotilde de Silva, the daughter of a Spanish nobleman and a woman nearly 40 years younger than him. They would have 2 children, but in a very controversial development, Clotilde would seduce his son Bolko, divorce Hans, and then marry Bolko. This relationship with her stepson resulted in children. Theoretically, this was not biological incest, but it was extremely tricky, as the children's mother had been married to both their grandfather and father. Patsy's only son George associated the Cornwallis Wests with one of the most esteemed families in modern British history. He entered the British military as a young man, a common pursuit for sons of the aristocracy in Victorian times. In the late 1890s, when he was in his mid-20s and she was in her early 40s, he began a relationship with a Lady Randolph Churchill, the American-born widow of Lord Randolph Churchill. They eventually married in the summer of 1900. With this, George became the stepfather of the future British Prime Minister and war leader, Winston Churchill, though he was only 16 days older than his stepson, the two men both having been born in November 1874. It has been speculated that George married an older woman to compensate for the lack of affection from his mother and his much more elderly father during his youth. This certainly chimes with his decision to again marry a somewhat older woman, the actress Stella Campbell, in 1914, having finalised the divorce from Jenny Churchill just weeks earlier. George met his second wife owing to his growing involvement with the London theatre community and his ambitions as a playwright. He spent much of his adult life dipping in and out of this world, though he would never achieve major success as a writer for the stage. During their union, they'd experienced considerable financial difficulties, owing to George's spendthrift nature. He was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1916 during the First World War. He subsequently began writing books to increase their income, notably a biography of his ancestor, Admiral William Cornwallis, and an autobiography of his own life. The third and last of Patsy and William's children was Constance Cornwallis West. Known to her family and friends as Sheila, she married Hugh Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, and one of the wealthiest aristocrats in Britain at that time, in February 1901. Such was Grosvenor's wealth that he was one of the most affluent individuals in the whole world in a time of ballooning riches in Europe and North America. It was widely known that Constance's mother Patsy had arranged the marriage through negotiations with Edward VII, who had just recently finally succeeded his long-lived mother. The marriage resulted in 3 children: Ursula Mary Olivia, born in 1902, Edward George, born in 1904, and Mary Constance, born in 1910. Edward George would die in childhood in 1909. The marriage afforded the family an extravagant life, but it was not happy, and Constance and her first husband divorced in 1919, following which she married John Fitzpatrick Lewis. Lewis was a much younger man, who Constance had met in the field hospital near Calais in France during the First World War. When Constance divorced to marry Lewis, she was given the largest alimony settlement in British legal history at that time. Patsy's relationship with Edward wasn't the only scandalous affair during her life. In the midst of the First World War, when Patsy was entering her 60s, she began a relationship with a Patrick Barrett, a much younger soldier who had been convalescing from shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder in a hospital near Calais in northern France. Her husband William was still alive, though elderly, eventually dying in 1917 at 82 years of age. Before his death, Patsy attempted to use her social status to get Barrett promoted within the military, a move which created a scandal as the affair soon became public. The fact that her husband was ill at the time and died not long afterwards made it even more controversial in the eyes of the public. She was criticised by the press as a manipulative harlot and would never recover from the scandal. Patsy died of stomach cancer on the 21st of July 1920 at 65 years of age. In the 1930s, Daisy developed a side career as a writer, publishing numerous salacious memoirs and edited versions of her extensive diaries. She lived to a relatively old age, dying in Silesia in the summer of 1943 at 70 years of age in the middle of the Second World War. George would remain married to Stella until her death in 1940. He developed Parkinson's disease in his later years, and after many years of suffering with the condition, killed himself on the 1st of April 1951 at 76 years of age. The suicide had clearly been planned out, and friends were in no doubt that his death on April Fool's Day was quite deliberately chosen. Constance's second union with John Lewis did not result in any children, though it was happy, and she and John remained married for decades to come. She lived a relatively uneventful later life by the standards of her family, and died in 1970 at the ripe old age of 94. While the most colourful chapters of the Cornwallis West family occurred as a result of the marriage of William and Patsy and the lives of their 3 children, the family continued after their time. Bolko died young in 1936 in the midst of a scandal of his marriage to his stepmother, but Hans Jr. and Alexander, Daisy's 2 other sons, both lived until 1984, dying within 4 weeks of each other early that year. Hans succeeded to his father's titles and estates. Despite marrying twice, he did not have any children, nor did Alexander, a bachelor for his whole life, who briefly became the Prince of Place for 4 weeks after his brother died and before his own death. When he in turn died, Bolko's son and namesake, Bolko Jr., became the new Prince of Pless. His passing in 2022 resulted in the royal line of Pless passing to another branch of the family, as Bolko died heirless. While George Cornwallis West did not have any legitimate children, some of Constance's children continued the family line in an important way. Mary became a female motor racing driver in the 1930s and 1940s, at a time when it was extremely rare for women to become involved in professional racing. She never married and did not have any children, but the Cornwallis West line is alive today. This is thanks to the descendants of Constance's eldest daughter Ursula, and her marriage to William Patrick Filmer Sankey. Now, we are going to the States to look at the story of a forgotten legend. The woman who would become famous as Bricktop was born as Ada Beatrice Smith in the town of Alderson in West Virginia on the 14th of August 1894. Somewhat eccentrically, she adopted several further middle names during her lifetime, including Queen Victoria, derived from the long-reigning monarch of Britain, and Virginia, after the region of America she came from. Her parents both had backgrounds as enslaved people in the American South. For instance, her mother was born in the midst of the American Civil War in the early 1860s, and was theoretically enslaved for the first 2 years of her life before Union victory in the war and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the United States. Her parents also had mixed race backgrounds, and Ada was partly Irish on her mother's side. When she was young, Ada's father died, and the family headed north from West Virginia to Chicago in the early stages of the Great Migration. This migration lasted for decades, from about 1910 to the 1960s, and saw millions of African Americans migrate from the southern states to the growing industrial cities of the north like Chicago, Detroit and Cleveland. Ada began working in saloons and bars in Chicago from a young age. It wasn't long before she was also appearing in stage productions in theatres. Her first appearance was in a staging of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Haymarket Theatre in Chicago. It was also during this period that she acquired the name Bricktop, seemingly in reference to her reddish hair, a byproduct of her Irish heritage. When she was just 16, Smith left home to tour the Midwest with a stage troupe, performing a vaudeville act with other African Americans. When this work ended, she drifted towards New York. There she was employed for a time in Barron's nightclub in Harlem, a part of New York which was transitioning around this time from being a white neighborhood dominated by old New York families of Dutch descent to become the center of a thriving African American cultural renaissance. She spent some of the 1910s and early 1920s here, though she also toured the country, returning for a time to Chicago and travelling out west to California. It was during these years that her skills as a jazz singer, vaudeville performer, and all-round dancer were honed. Despite her moderate success in America, in the early 1920s, Smith decided to leave the United States for Europe. In a recent biography of Bricktop, written in the first person, as though from her perspective, and using her correspondence and own writings as source material, her decision to relocate from Harlem in New York to Paris in France is explained in the following terms. I had intercepted a wire Jean Bullard sent to Coney's Inn in Harlem asking for a girl to come over to Paris to sing at Le Grand Duc. I had been looking to shape things up in my life. Jobs were getting harder to come by for us singers and dancers, no matter how high-toned we were. We were all competing for a few spots. The jazzmen travelling back and forth across the Atlantic said the living was easier in Paris. Best of all, it was free of race prejudice. I dreamed about eating, drinking and socialising, wherever and with whomever I choose. Thus, Smith set off for France either in late 1923 or early 1924. Smith had moved to a city which was the cultural capital of the world. Paris had emerged in this role in the second half of the 19th century, when writers like Émile Zola, Alexandre Dumas, and Marcel Proust lived here along with poets and painters such as Baudelaire and Monet. These people frequented clubs like the Moulin Rouge and established Paris's reputation as the world centre of dance culture and debauchery. In the aftermath of the First World War and the crises that followed it, such as the Spanish flu pandemic and the civil wars and revolutions which gripped countries like Germany, Turkey and Russia, a new generation of writers, poets, painters and dancers flocked to Paris. These included people like the writers James Joyce and Ernest Hemingway, and the poet Asa Pond. The scene was propped up by an enormous economic boom and financial speculation from 1923 onwards, one which would catastrophically burst in 1929, but which saw a lot of money flowing around Paris prior to that. In this environment, there was peak demand for jazz singers, dancers, and others associated with Paris's vibrant nightlife. Bricktop quickly emerged onto the Paris scene, becoming a close acquaintance of the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald as he spent time in the French capital, Hemingway, and others. Where these writers and artists came, more people followed, and soon people were showing up to Ada's shows once figures like Fitzgerald and Hemingway began frequenting them. Her prominence continued to rise, and she was often hired by Cole Porter as an entertainer at his parties. Here she was known to teach guests the latest dance craze, such as the Charleston and the Black Bottom, and it is even said that she instructed the future King Edward VIII how to do both. She was already considering branching out and setting up her own place, annoyed by how small the Parisian dance clubs were, by comparison with the venues back in the US. However, her first effort ran into licensing problems and never got off the ground. In 1926, Smith finally managed to open her own place. She called it Chez Bricktop, and it was an instant success, becoming an important cultural spot in Paris in the second half of the Roaring Twenties. It produced many legendary tales. On one occasion, the great American writer John Steinbeck, author of The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men, was drunkenly thrown out of Chez Bricktop by Smith. Steinbeck famously apologized by having a taxi full of roses sent across Paris to the club. Afterwards, he was welcomed back by Ada. The famed Fred Astaire even visited and performed at the club. The club is also referenced in numerous published works of the time by Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Evelyn Waugh and others. It was short-lived success though. In the autumn of 1929, the Wall Street crash occurred, followed by the Great Depression. As this all commenced, the booze-soaked jazz scene and parties of the 1920s became a distant memory, and clubs like Cher Bricktop struggled. Many had to eventually close their doors. Cher Bricktop was popular enough that it continued for a while, but eventually the lights went out. Smith returned to the US for a time, where she found sporadic work. The precarious nature of this, combined with the death of her mother in 1938, left her suffering from severe anxiety, while the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 further dented the entertainment industry at a time when it had only just begun to recover properly from the effects of the Great Depression. Yet, she had made her mark on Europe in the 1920s and would soon return there. While the 1930s and early 1940s were difficult times for Bricktop, she soon got back on her feet. In 1942, she had relocated to Mexico, one of the few parts of the world which was relatively unaffected by the war. There she set up a successful club in Mexico City and managed it for several years. Then, as Europe rebuilt and the economy recovered after the destruction of the Second World War, she headed back to Paris in 1949. Sadly, the city was no longer as she remembered it. The French capital lost its place as the cultural capital of the world in the 1930s, and it never really got it back, the title shifting to New York City, a place where Ada was well aware that vaudeville and dancing were not in high demand. Accordingly, she headed to Rome instead, after a brief attempt at newfound success in Paris. In the Italian capital, she had something of an Indian summer, running a successful club here through the 1950s. She entertained many famous guests here, including Elizabeth Taylor, Frank Sinatra, Martin Luther King Jr., and more. She even had a close friendship with the abdicated King of Egypt, King Farouk I, for many years, with Farouk bringing Bricktop gifts from his travels like bottles of perfume and cigars. One element of Smith's life, which has been widely commentated on in recent years, is her sexuality. In 1927 in Paris, she met and began a relationship with a saxophone player by the name of Peter Duconge. They married in 1929, though the marriage soon ran into trouble as Smith became aware of Duconge's affairs. They effectively split up in the 1930s, yet they were never officially divorced, and they remained legally married until Duconge died in 1967. However, it seems very likely that Smith was also bisexual. In the second half of the 1920s, one of the most noted performers at Cher Bricktop was the American-born jazz singer Josephine Baker, a woman notable for being the first African-American woman to star in a major motion picture when she appeared in Siren of the Tropics in 1927. Bricktop told one of Baker's children many years later that they had been in a sexual relationship back in the 1920s when Baker was a regular performer at Cher Bricktop. Bricktop closed her final club on the Via Veneto in Rome in 1961. She was 67 years old by then, and when interviewed about the closure stated, quote, "I'm tired, honey, tired of staying up till dawn every day." She returned to America, where she occasionally forayed out of retirement, opening clubs for brief periods of time in New York, although there were never sustained efforts. Instead, her final years were largely dedicated to charitable work, and she became a devout Roman Catholic. Smith died in her sleep at home in her apartment in Manhattan on the 1st of February 1984. She was 89 years of age and had lived a long and successful life. She was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Although she had been out of the public eye for many years and the jazz scene was long gone, her death was widely reported on in the New York Times, and other prominent publications. Next, we are heading back to the 19th century, but this time to Canada. Maud Allan was born as Eula Maud Allan Durant in the city of Toronto in Canada on the 27th of August 1873. Her parents were William Allan Durant and Isabella Durant. Maud had an older brother Theodore, who was born in 1871 and would play a prominent role in her early adult years. As a child, Maud emerged as a talented musician even before she reached her teenage years, learning to play the piano from Miss Lichtenstein in Toronto. In 1884, when she was 11 years old, Maud's father had left British Canada entirely to head for California in the United States, a booming state off the back of the gold rush of the 1850s and the oil rush which followed from the 1870s onwards. 3 years later, in 1887, now that he had established himself with a house and a job in San Francisco, William Durant sent for his family to come and join him in the US, and so Maud, her mother and brother left Canada. In California, Maud continued to learn and play the piano. She excelled at it, playing for some of San Francisco's leading families, including Adolphe Sutro, a German-American philanthropist who served as mayor of the city in the mid-1890s. He might also have been Maud's grandfather, as her mother Isabella had been adopted, and the family seems to have come into some unexplained money in the 1890s after connecting with Sutro. By that time, Maud's musical talent was well recognized enough by her tutors that one of them, Eugene Bonelli of the San Francisco Grand Academy of Music, urged her to travel to Germany, the leading country for classical music in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This she duly did, leaving for Europe early in 1895, when she was 22 years old. The plan had been for her mother and brother to join her there once Theodore, who was training to become a doctor, had completed his medical studies. But tragedy struck the family just weeks after Maud left for Europe. On the 14th of April 1895, Maud's brother Theodore was apprehended for 2 heinous crimes that had been committed at San Francisco's Emmanuel Baptist Church. Well, he was a prime suspect in the murder of Blanche Lamont and Minnie Williams, 2 young women who were part of the church's congregation. He maintained his innocence during the ensuing trial in September 1895, but he was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was hanged at San Quentin prison in January 1898. As Maud was still living in Berlin, she was unable to say a final farewell to her brother. She always maintained he was innocent, and blamed herself for what had happened, believing things would have been different if she never left home. As you might expect, the death stayed with her for many years. Hey, just a quick side note, if you want to check out the life of Theodore Durant after this video, be sure to check out the video by Briefcase. It's an excellent video, links in the description. Maud was not deterred by the shame which her brother's crimes, trial and conviction had brought on her family. Instead, it seems to have made her more motivated than ever to succeed, and she was now determined to become an acclaimed pianist. It seems like her hard work was paying off, as in the summer of 1901, she finally gained entry into the school of the famed Italian pianist Ferruccio Busoni, located in Weimar. She had also begun going by the name Maud Allan during these years, likely out of concern that using the Durant name would continue to link her to her brother and the murders. In Weimar, things were to change for Maud in ways which she cannot have expected. Here, surrounded by some of the most talented musicians in the world, she appears to have been fazed by the realization of what level of accomplishment she would have to reach to succeed as a European pianist. But Busoni had another idea. Shortly after her arrival in Weimar, Maud was involved in a dance performance at the Academy, one which led to Busoni advising her to abandon her ambitions to become a pianist and instead focus on dancing. He introduced her to Marcel Remy, who became her agent and manager. With this new direction and the advice of Remy, Maud soon reinvented herself to capitalize on both her good looks and her musicality. She now aimed to become an expressionist dancer, an art form which was very much in its infancy in Europe in the 1900s. Allen quickly adapted to it, making her stage debut in Vienna in the winter of 1903, and quickly moving on to tour numerous major European cities such as Brussels, Berlin and Cologne over the next several years. During these performances, she combined her new pursuit with her love of classical music, dancing to Beethoven, Bach, Chopin and Schubert. Maud Allen is primarily known today for the Dance of the Seven Veils, a performance piece which brought her to international attention in the 1900s and 1910s. The inspiration for this came to her when watching a rendition of Oscar Wilde's Salome in Vienna in 1906. The play is a one-act tragedy, which Wilde had written in 1891, based on the tale of Salome, the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas, who ruled Judea in the early 1st century AD. According to the tale, Salome had convinced Herod to bring her the head of John the Baptist, a religious leader who was creating quite a stir in Judea at the time, in return for dancing for him. Herod, overcome with lust, agrees to do so. Wilde's play necessarily involved a dance sequence. Having seen the play, Maud began working on a version of the erotically charged dance. This dance of Salome which Allen performed is often known as the Dance of the Seven Veils. Allen was performing the Dance of the Seven Veils by 1907. Reviews of her performance were unenthusiastic, but Allen's rendition was different to most others, as she danced largely naked, covered only by jewellery and some see-through bits of silken veils. Moreover, she gained immense notoriety in 1908 when she travelled to London to perform the dance at the Palace Theatre in the West End, a highly controversial move, as the Dance of the Seven Veils had been banned in Britain years before, after Wilde's arrest, trial and conviction for indecency under the laws of the time. Yet, Allen was not prevented from performing. In the end, she remained in London for 18 months, during which she performed the dance over 250 times. By the time her London residency ended, Allen had acquired international fame. She would relocate to London and live there for most of the next 30 years, but during the 1910s, she also set off on a world tour, performing in cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Kansas, San Francisco, and Los Angeles in the United States, followed by a tour of South Africa and parts of Asia, where she played Cape Town, Calcutta, and many other cities. On the back of these, she also carved out a small position in the developing motion picture industry out in Hollywood, appearing in The Rugmaker's Daughter in 1915, in which she also performed a version of the dance. Allen's sexuality was a source of continuous speculation during her own lifetime, and has been ever since as well. We do know that in the mid-1900s, she was involved in an affair with Ferruccio Busoni, the director of the Music Academy in Weimar, who had encouraged her to shift from the piano to dancing. However, she would never marry, and there were no sustained heterosexual relationships to speak of in her later years. It is consequently assumed that Allen was actually bisexual, with a greater preference for female relationships. This would certainly tie in with the recorded evidence for her many years in London. Around 1910 she became involved in an affair with Margot Asquith, the wife of the Liberal Prime Minister of Britain, Herbert Asquith. Asquith even began paying for Allen's apartment next to Regent's Park, an arrangement which would last for the better part of 20 years. In 1928, Herbert Asquith died, leaving his wife almost penniless, despite his successful political career. Margot consequently stopped paying for Maud's apartment, which led to the end of their relationship and the beginning of a new affair between Allen and her secretary, Werner Aldrich. Eventually, Aldrich moved into the apartment at Regent's Park and lived there for 10 years, but it was a controlling relationship in which Alan, who was 20 years older than Aldrich, abused her younger partner emotionally and financially. When it ended many years later, Maud threatened to expose Aldrich's homosexuality. Alan's sexuality was central to the most infamous part of her lifetime in the late 1910s and early 1920s. In 1918, towards the end of the First World War, she returned to London to take up the lead role in the new production of Salome, which was being produced by the theatre director Jack Green. Green's production was controversial, as a British law had been issued some years earlier, which banned biblical characters such as John the Baptist from being depicted on stage. Consequently, Green circumvented the ban by making this an application-only viewing, which was not seemingly open to the public. In doing so, he could claim that the play was actually just a performance in front of a private gathering. The play sparked controversy, and in turn led to a religiously inclined Member of Parliament by the name of Noel Pemberton Billing to publish an article in his own journal, Vigilante. In this, Billing accused Alan of being a lesbian, something which was frowned upon in British society at the time, but which was not illegal. Billing also suggested, in a paranoid vein, that many of those who were applying to see Green's play were homosexual and were possibly being blackmailed by the German government, with whom Britain was still at war. Maud responded by suing Billing for libel. The case, when it came to the trial, became something of a sensation in the British newspapers, but it ended badly for Alan. Billing claimed Alan was insane, claiming it was hereditary, and highlighted elements of her brother's murder trial and execution as proof. Also, the judge essentially ignored the suit, and instead focused on the fact that Wilde's play, which was effectively banned in London, was being performed in the city at all. In the end, Maud lost her suit, and the case created immensely bad publicity for her. It seriously damaged her career in Britain in particular, but also many other countries, and this couldn't come at a worse time, as she had very bad spending habits and had very little savings put aside from all her years of work. Despite the public scandal which went along with the libel trial, Maud did not retreat from public life in its aftermath, but continued to dance throughout the 1920s and 1930s. She also expanded her work as an actress. For instance, in 1932 she appeared in The Miracle, directed by Max Reinhardt, one of the most prominent German-language theatre directors of the first half of the 20th century. Her dancing continued through these years, that is until 1936, when at 62 years of age, she gave her last performance at the Redlands Bowl in California. Maud never had any children, and with the death of her mother in 1930, her father having died in 1917, she was increasingly isolated in the world. Her mother had been a travelling companion for many years, and had also lived with Maud for some time at her home in Regent's Park in London. Thus, her death was a major blow to Maud. Nevertheless, she continued to reside in London until the early 1940s, when another difficulty struck her as her home was bombed as a result of the German Blitz of London during the Second World War. Increasingly impoverished, Maud left for the United States in 1943 and settled in California. There she largely lived on the generosity of old friends, for despite having once earned as much as £500 per week in her heyday, Alan was broke by the 1940s. She also worked for a time with the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation in their offices in Santa Monica. When she died in Los Angeles in 1956, at the age of 83 in a nursing home, she was effectively a pauper, but the memory of her times as a leading protagonist of the Dance of the Seven Veils lives on today. For our final story, we will be looking at New York's ultimate 20th century socialite. The woman who would become known to the world as Babe Paley was born as Barbara Cushing in Boston, Massachusetts on the 5th of July 1915. Her father was Harvey Cushing, a neurosurgeon and writer who rose to considerable prominence in the 1910s as a pioneer of brain surgery, and her mother was Catherine Cushing. Barbara had several siblings, but she is most closely associated with her two elder sisters, Mary and Betsy. In 1940, Mary would marry William Vincent Astor, a scion of the enormously wealthy Astor family, while Betsy had two prominent marriages, one to James Roosevelt, the son of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then a second marriage in 1942 to John Hay Whitney, the US ambassador to Britain and president of the Museum of Modern Art. As we will see shortly, Barbara also married two prominent figures in East Coast society, and as a result of their marriages, wealth, positions as style icons, and their looks, Barbara, Mary and Betsy became known in the 1940s as the Fabulous Cushing Sisters. During her youth, Barbara attended the Westover School, a preparatory school in Connecticut, which is generally attended by children of the upper class of New England and New York. From there she headed to the Windsor School in Boston, which she graduated from in 1934 at 18. This was around the same time that she suffered from a serious accident. Early in 1934, while driving home from a party on Long Island, Barbara was in a major car accident in which her front teeth were knocked out. As a result, she had to undergo extensive reconstructive surgery around both her mouth and jaw. However, as dental work went in the 1930s, it was a tremendous success, and once the bruises had healed, it was clear that the incident had not diminished her good looks. In 1938, Barbara, who by her adult years was known to all her friends and acquaintances as Babe, had landed a job with Vogue magazine. Her position gave her access to dresses and clothes designed by some of the most prominent fashion houses in the world, and in due course, she began to garner a reputation for herself as a style icon. Her personal taste was somewhat unconventional, often combining clothes with jewellery and other accessories in an eclectic fashion. Soon, Barbara's style was garnering national attention. In 1941, Time magazine placed her at number 2 on its list of the world's best-dressed women, coming second only to Wallis Simpson, the American socialite who had caused controversy in Britain in the mid-1930s owing to her scandalous relationship with King Edward VIII. It was just the first of many appearances on the Time list and many others. Eventually, in 1958, she was inducted into the Fashion Hall of Fame after placing on the International Best Dressed list 14 times. Babe was also well known for her marriages. Shortly after she began working at Vogue, she met Stanley Grafton Mortimer Jr., a scion of the wealthy New York Mortimer family, which had a major stake in the city's real estate business. His maternal grandfather, Henry Morgan Tilford, had also been one of the founding shareholders in Standard Oil, which for a time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the world's most profitable company. After a brief courtship, he and Babe married in East Hampton in New York. Babe and Stanley's marriage quickly resulted in 2 children, a son named Stanley after his father born in 1942, and a daughter named Amanda. Despite this, the marriage was not a happy one. The cracks within it were disguised for some time in the early to mid-1940s, as Babe was pregnant, and Stanley was generally absent, serving on the Pacific Front during the Second World War. However, shortly after the war ended and Stanley returned home, they decided to go their separate ways. They divorced in 1946, with Babe receiving a substantial financial settlement. Shortly after her divorce, Babe met William Pasha Paley. William was a broadcaster and businessman who built the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS, as it is better known today. Although it started out as a humble radio station, it eventually became one of America's largest television networks, introducing many innovations which revolutionized the face of the media in the United States. He had become wealthy in tandem and had also married Dorothy Hart Hearst in 1932, the former daughter-in-law of William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful media baron of the early 20th century, whom Orson Welles had based Citizen Kane on. When Babe and William first met in 1946, he was still married to Dorothy, but they were estranged from each other. Thus, after a short courtship, Babe and William wished to marry. He eventually finalized his divorce from Dorothy on the 24th of July 1947, and just 4 days later, Babe and he married. Their union was a mixed affair. 2 children followed soon after they were wed, William in 1948 and Kate in 1950. Babe provided the basis for William to break into the high society of the East Coast in the late 1940s, while he brought an unlimited source of funding to affairs. This money allowed for the purchase and development of a number of lavish properties in New York, Long Island, and a country retreat in New Hampshire. Here, Babe held parties attended by some of the foremost celebrities, writers, artists, and political figures of the time. Additionally, she had an allowance of $160,000 per year, a sum equivalent to around $2 million today, which she used to invest lavishly in jewellery and dresses. Nevertheless, it was also a troubled marriage. William engaged in a string of extramarital affairs, which after a certain point he made little effort to disguise. For her part, Babe had quit her job at Vogue when she married William, and when the parties ended, it was often a lonely life. Eventually, she too began to engage in affairs. Yet, despite these liaisons and the unhappy nature of their marriage, Babe and William would never divorce, maintaining their union for a variety of social and business reasons. Babe was far from the only high society fashion and style icons of the post-war period, and she had many rivals. None was as fierce as her friendship/rivalry with Gloria Guinness, a sign of a wealthy and powerful Mexican family which traced its roots all the way back to Christopher Columbus. Between the 1930s and 1950s, she married 4 times. Like Babe, several of her marriages were to wealthy and prominent individuals, notably her 3rd marriage to a grandson of King Fahd I of Egypt, and her 4th to Thomas Leol Guinness, a scion of the Guinness brewing and banking dynasty from Ireland. As a result of their respective marriages and positions as style icons, Babe and Gloria vied for prominence in the pages of America's magazines and newspapers in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. They moved in the same circles and at times could have said to have been friends. But there was also a fierce rivalry between them at the same time. Babe used to spread spurious tales about how Gloria had been a nightclub worker in Mexico before coming to America, while Gloria could be just as petty. On one occasion, she invited Paley to a gathering on her private yacht, informing her that it was a low-key informal affair. When Babe arrived with some modest attire, she found that the soiree was anything but a low-key affair, as Gloria emerged in her finest attire and a small mountain of diamonds. They were frenemies for sure. Accounts of Babe Paley's life have typically depicted her as a neglectful mother to her 4 children, one who prioritized her social life and status within American high society over raising them in any nurturing fashion. There seems little disputing that this was the case. Her 2nd child from her 1st marriage, Amanda, who went on to enjoy a successful career as an urban planner in Manhattan and a senior partner at Bloomberg Associates, stated that her relationship with her mother was non-existent, and that the distance between them was most certainly owing to her mother's personal decisions. Babe Paley is also well known today owing to her relationship with Truman Capote, the acclaimed author of works such as Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. In the course of the 1950s and 1960s, Capote became one of the most significant figures in American high society. Openly gay, at a time when being so was hazardous in American society, he developed a clique of wealthy, attractive female friends, whom he referred to as his swans. Babe was known to be his favourite amongst these, and was one of the prominent attendees at the Black and White Ball, a masquerade ball thrown by Capote in the Plaza Hotel in New York in November 1966, sometimes termed the Party of the Century. The Black and White Ball was a zenith of Capote and Paley's relationship. Unbeknownst to his swans and many of his other acquaintances, Capote had been working for some time on a new novel entitled Answered Prayers, a depiction of American high society which critiqued many of its characters, some of whom were quite obviously based on members of Capote's social circle, Babe included. An unfinished version of the book was only posthumously published in the 1980s, after Capote had died, but a version of the start of the book entitled La Côte Basque 1965 was published by Esquire magazine in 1975. This was based on meetings of the characters at the famous Manhattan restaurant La Côte Basque, and presented a heavily satirical view of the people who mixed here. Babe recognized that one of the characters was clearly based on her. When she read it, she decided to completely terminate her relationship with Capote. They never spoke to each other ever again. Indeed, the publication of La Côte Basque 1965 marked the high point of Capote's gradual social suicide. There would be no more swans thereafter. By the time she terminated her relationship with Capote, Paley's health was declining. For many years she had been a heavy smoker, with a habit of up to 2 packs a day. After years of respiratory problems, she was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1974, just shy of her 60th birthday. In the 1970s, this was effectively a death sentence, as were nearly all cancer diagnoses, unlike today. Babe preserved for 4 years. In the meantime, she planned the party that would be held for her funeral, and stopped dyeing her hair and simply let it go grey. She died on the 6th of July 1978 at 63 years of age, and after her elaborate funeral, she was buried at St. John's Church in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Given her marriages, her associations with figures such as Truman Capote, and her status as one of the leading style icons of her time, Barbara Paley has unsurprisingly featured in popular culture on various occasions since. Prominent portrayals of her include those by Michelle Harrison and Sigourney Weaver in the films Capote and Infamous in 2005 and 2006, both of which focused on Capote. She is also portrayed by Naomi Watts in the second series of Feud, directed by Gus Van Sant. Thank you so much everyone for watching this compilation video. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the stories down below in the comments, and if you want more videos like this, also let me know. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. And anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.